Hi, everybody. Um, I wanted to start out by telling you Zamina kind of explained it, but if there are any weird noises, background noises, my puppy's out in the backyard. My kids might come in. They're not supposed to, but they might. And I just wanted to let you know. I'm glad to see everybody here. If you have any questions, just how do we do it? Do we type it like in a chat and then we
Yes.
answer it?
So any questions, just put them in the chat and either Emily or Emily will answer them for you, or I will ask them out loud so Callie can.
Okay. And just to tell y'all, usually whenever I plan for classes, I'm like an over planner. So I need a plan A, B, C, because by the time that it gets to you, I want everything to be perfect so that you see how it goes if everything goes according to plan. And it's kind of funny because this time I got so busy with all of my kids and the puppy and stuff. I almost spaced this class until about Friday, whenever Emily was like, "Are you ready?" And I was like, "For what?" Anyway, so I got it together and made it happen. But by the time we got to today, I am like tired, and not just a little bit tired, it's like next level tired. And so as I was preparing, I got super frustrated and I was like, "Oh, I don't like it whenever this happens." And I almost want to start over because I'm a perfectionist by nature. And I think that's kind of why I like this craft. But anyway, as I started working through, I just completely ran out of time to be insanely perfectionist. And so I started doing the things that I do and I used to do whenever I needed to make cookies in a hurry and I was out of time, or, just like had to make it happen because it was an order or whatever reason. And as I was doing it, I was like, "Hey, this is kind of cool because this is like good stuff to know. Because if you don't know these things, it can really hold you up or completely like sabotage or mess up what you're working on." So, we're going to do a decorating class, and I'm going to start with the actual cookies. And the cookies, since they're royal icing, I have step outs, which are like made for TV so we can move from step to step. The cookies don't actually take very long to decorate. So as I finish decorating and as we make it through, if you do have questions, really let me know because this is the perfect time to ask. And as I finish, I'm going to go through like the next step things, like things that you can do later or what to do if this doesn't go right, just so you know for future reference. So you don't think that I kind of hate the fact that sometimes that I've given the illusion that everything is perfect and pretty and nothing ever goes wrong through the videos I make. And whenever I do that, it's with good intentions because I just want it to be seamless and get the idea across quickly. But like I said, as I worked, I realized, hey, this is good to know. Like, this didn't work. What can I do? So that's what we're going to do today. I'm not quite ready yet, babe. Okay, my husband's switching, so I'm going to hold up what I'm doing and let you know. I see a question on there. The cookies are not pre-made. They're actually, you bake them at home, but I've got a recipe online. Emily can give you the link. Okay, so what we're going to be making today is a version of chocolate covered strawberry cookies. Can you see those pretty good? And the ones that we're actually making are a little bit different than what I have here on the table, but we're going to do both versions, and that kind of ties into why. Whenever I decorate cookies, usually whenever I give instructions or classes, I provide printable templates like these, and they're paper templates for cookie decorating. The reason that I use these is because part of the professional look is uniform cookies. And it doesn't really have to like be uniform, but I think that's what intimidates people. So I always provide these as guides. So I'm going to show you this and how I use them. And there's also a link for you to print out your own as you work. So we've got this template that I printed out from online. And the first thing I'm going to do before I start decorating is cut out this side. This is actually the tracing template. If you have a cookie projector or some sort of device that it's almost like a light that shines down and puts the image on a blank cookie, then you can use this side, but I give them both to people so they have them available. Okay, now we can look down. Hi, everybody. And I was making sure y'all could see me and watching myself as I work. And if for some reason I get out of frame or my head's in the way, y'all just give me a heads up. And so I make sure everybody can see. I'm not going to use this side. This is the projector side. So I always save these in my cookie cutter drawer with the cutters they go with. I'm going to put it aside. I'm using the traceable side this time. And this is really everything you need to decorate this cookie. And I always cut these out on camera. I probably could save us some time by doing them ahead of time. But I just really like people to see the point of these paper templates. And again, it's just like a guide. I think like whenever I first started decorating cookies, I didn't have any of the fancy equipment, and a lot of the things that we use now didn't exist. And so I had to find ways to make things easier on myself. And also, as I started a blog, I realized that I'm a doodler and kind of an artist by nature. Like it's something that's fun for me, but there's a lot of people who aren't. And whenever I wrote a blog post and was just like, oh, trace the chocolate line here, it's easy enough, but sometimes it's not. And so I wanted to make sure that there were foolproof ways. Okay, so I left the stem behind. I don't really need it. And I cut these 2 sections. And what we're going to do with these is take a blank cookie. And essentially, we're creating a little coloring page for you to decorate cookies with. Also, if you're very steady-handed, you don't even have to use the template like I'm using. You can just like go for it and draw. But see, I lay the template on the cookie. It's a little bit smaller than the cookies because my recipe spreads just a little bit, but that's no big thing. And then I use a black food color marker to kind of create a coloring page. And this is also helpful if you're decorating cookies with friends, kids. Sometimes doing this step for them ahead of time just makes it easy for them to jump right in. So anyway, you see I use this, and now I actually have the design drawn on the cookie, and then you don't have to guess about where to put things. And again, the marker I used is a Sweet Sugarbelle black food color marker. A little tip for this. If you're doing a cookie like this one that maybe has white underneath, sometimes black can bleed from the cookie up into the icing. Not always, but sometimes. You can also use other colors, like yellow is a safe color. If you're going along the top and you're afraid that the black will show, you can use red because it'll kind of camouflage. But keep in mind that it doesn't have to be this black pen. You just kind of have to think with each design what works best. Okay, I'm going to put the little chocolate piece aside. I'm going to keep this one right here because that's what we'll end up using this later. And I'm going to put the next step up here so you can see where we're going. I'm going to start out with dark brown piping consistency icing and a number 2 icing tip. And the first step is I'm going to add the brown outline. And just a little tip, before you start on the cookie, it's good to have something beside you to pipe on to make sure that your tip is not clogged and that everything's flowing smoothly before you get started on the cookie. Now, I'm going to try to make a mistake so I can show you what to do if it doesn't go that way. But that's kind of the funny joke of this. If I try to make a mistake, it doesn't usually work out that way. But I'm going to try to make a mistake to show you what to do if you mess up, but I'm also going to outline. So I start at always a corner, kind of where it makes natural sense to have a junction, so there's not any weird like points. Then I outline in blood. Let me grab another cookie. Can you give me another blank cookie out of that box? I'm actually going to do another one just to show you. We're going to let this one set. Whenever you pipe on the cookie, I'll talk you through piping whenever we work on this next one. The best thing to remember is you don't drag the piping tip along the edge of the cookie. You lift up and away. So I'm going to make one more just to be safe. And then we'll talk through that. Do we have any questions while we're at it? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, we do have a couple.
Okay.
Let me see. Do you have to use a paper, or can you just draw it on?
You can go crazy. If you're brave enough, then the paper is just time spent that you don't need to spend. But I just provide the paper just to give people, it's almost like a teaching tool, like almost training wheels. Maybe that's the best word. So I provide them so people have training wheels until they're comfortable. And the cutters are actually designed to be vague enough that they can shift to different things. Like this can be a fish or a princess or a jellyfish, things like that. But they're also vague enough that you can put your own spin on it. So you don't necessarily have to imitate my style, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense.
Okay, I'm going to do this one. I'm going to outline one more. I also always have some sort of wet cloth handy. I wet one for myself and lost it in the meantime, but just to clean your tip off before you start again. But you start right here at a corner, lift up and away, and see you're kind of letting the icing fall along the curve. Then I'm coming back down and around. So okay. There we go. Can y'all see that?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. And then you've got the outline. Now, just to show you, if for some reason you mess up and you don't like your outline, this is one of those, instead of going straight into crazy cookie, this is what I would do if I like somehow miss the edge. Or we have these little scraper tools. This isn't the exact one in the tool set at Michael's. The new one has a smaller end and a larger end. I don't know what I did with mine, but same concept. These little scrapers are actually like small putty knives. And can y'all see that? You can scrape the outline straight off of the cookie and start again in case you make a mistake. The only thing that you need to remember about this is that there's like a perfect point of scrapage. I just made that up. But if it's too hard and you try to scrape it off, it might take chunks of cookie away and leave little divots that make it hard to outline. But if it's too wet, it's going to smear everywhere. So it's best to let that line set for a minute or 3 if you mess up, so it's easier to remove. But see, if you mess up a cookie, the cookie's not messed up. You have it to use again. Okay, so now that we have this part outlined, I'm going to switch to the other view again, and I'm going to show you how I fill my icing bottles and explain a little bit of this. And I hope nobody's getting too bored, but I wanted to throw all this in. Okay, we're going to switch to this view. Whenever I mix my icing, I use measuring cups like this one. And I do that for 2 reasons. The measurements lets me know about how much icing I'm making. So I know that each icing pod that I create like this can be about 2 ounces of icing, sometimes a little bit less. And then now that I'm about to tell you, I don't remember how many ounce these bottles are, but I know that if I make about 3/4 of a cup of icing, I can pretty much guess how much it'll cover. And I've got specific numbers for that if you ever want to know, but I don't have them right with me. If there's questions later, if you comment on my social, I can give you better numbers. But anyway, I mix the color in these measuring cups just to get a good idea of how much I'm making so I don't make way too much or too little. And then I make one consistency. I use a spray bottle to thin it to piping consistency, which goes in the piping bag. And then I spray more water in it to thin it down to flood consistency. And so I wish that, can you show this from the top down, please? We'll see if you can get a good look at it. Once I thin it down, if I let it sit for a while, you can, this is probably a bad color to do it, but all the air bubbles rise to the top. Let's see if that, y'all can kind of see. But anyway, if you let it sit and let the air bubbles rise to the top, then you can use this little spatula and stir it again. And it removes a lot of those air bubbles, which is how I get that pretty smooth, like, I don't want to say flawless because it's not really flawless, but that not very air bubbly texture. Like I just happened to grab one that it really almost is flawless. But by letting the air bubbles rise up to the top while it's thinning and then stirring them out, that's how I'm able to make sure that I minimize the amount of air bubbles as much as possible. And then let's switch back. Thing number 2 that I love about these bottles is that they have a wider mouth. And so like once upon a time, whenever I started decorating, we were like looking at about that size of a little hole that's kind of hard to get things in. We did wider mouth bottles. So you can take something with a pour spout and pour it in without having to be like a magician. But see, the measuring cup also allows you to kind of just scoop it down the spout. Y'all can see pretty well, right, babe? Okay. My husband is a really good helper. He can kind of read my mind at this point.
So Callie, we have a question about this. Is this royal icing or just melted chocolate? Can you talk a little bit?
This is actually royal icing that I colored to look like melted chocolate. If you want to, you can actually decorate cookies with melts, but that's not my department. So I have like no business telling you how. It could be fun, but melts and royal icing don't mix because melts have a lot of oil in them. Royal icing doesn't, and they can destroy each other. To make icing this color, you use whatever brown food color you can find. And if you buy them in the store, a lot of them have a lot of red in them. So I always end up adding a few drops of green, which is the contrasting color to brown to kind of neutralize the red in it. And then to get that extra deep brown, so I'm saying this is more like dark chocolate than milk chocolate, I add a little bit of black. And icing develops over time. So whenever I first color this icing, it looks like brown, but it's not rich or thick, kind of like watered down coffee versus espresso. But if you give it like an hour to set, then you'll come back and it'll be fully saturated and that color will bloom in there, and it makes a world of difference. And on that note, you do have to be careful not to overcolor because it can also affect the royal icing. It's best to color it light and add to it if you need to, or even wait till it dries, because certain colors like browns, reds, blues, and greens, even purples, can really surprise you how much they change. Like I've made footballs before that started out like a nice nutmeg color and were basically black by the time they dried. But
Perfect.
okay, so
sorry,
do we have any more?
Just one question about the icing. How long will it last in the refrigerator?
It can honestly indefinitely. I would say give it a week or two. My friend and I have talked this through. Her husband is like a biologist, and he said at some point lots and lots of sugar keeps things from actually growing bacteria. But scientifically, like we don't have the funds to prove it. But like you think crystallized ginger, things like that. I always do the smell test. I smell it, and if I think it smells good, I'll still use it whenever I don't think it smells good, which I don't even know if it's like scientific or if there's a rhyme or reason, but if I don't like how it smells, I don't use it. But I use icing over and over again, kind of like, you know, the pizza parlor that has the dough that came from a bucket of yeast that was started like 80 years ago. I'll use it until I don't like the smell. But you can also store it on the counter too. It doesn't necessarily require refrigeration. And I used to put it in the refrigerator just for my peace of mind because I didn't have like the science background or the knowledge that he gave me. But these days I just leave it on the counter because I got to the point where I was more scared about refrigerator noise, or not noise, smells seeping in than I was about anything like spoiling. But Royal Icing does have a pretty good reputation for that because, you know, you see a lot of the decorations and stuff, like they almost don't have a expiration date, sprinkles, things like that. Most of the time, whenever people tell me they've thrown them away, it is because they didn't like the smell versus like they actually saw anything happening to the icing or the decorations, etc. But I hope that made sense.
Definitely. We do have a couple more questions. Do you want me to go ahead and ask them, or
yes, I'm going to switch views and work as we ask, but I can still talk.
Perfect
as well.
Okay, so is it okay to add flavoring to the icing?
You absolutely need to add flavoring. I think that most people that don't like royal icing, that's what's missing. If you flavor it, my sister-in-law always says mine tastes like marshmallow cream. But if you smell meringue powder, sometimes it has a smell. Like open the can, smell it. And if you don't add flavoring, then sometimes it can happen that the flavor of the icing is how the meringue smelled. I use a combination of emulsions. The biggie is to make sure that there's no oil in the extracts and flavorings you're using. But Michael's actually has Loran, and I like Watkins brand. I don't know if you can like actually order that or if it's like you have to order it through somebody. But I use a little bit of almond, a little bit of butter vanilla, and a lot of clear vanilla. Okay, so I'm going to do this one more time really quick. I just used flood consistency icing to flood that outline. I'll prep another one in case we need to see it again and talk through it. And then I will move on to the next step and see if we have any more questions. Okay, there's the outline. Another little side note, let me show you. We need to switch views, cameraman. Whenever I work with icing, I always use this as an icing holder. And first thing I usually start this with, I should have told you, there's no one way to decorate a cookie. Like I give you what works for me, but if there's things that work for you, you have to do it your way, become comfortable with the medium. I still like icing bottles and piping bags. So whenever I use my bags, and I don't use tipless bags, I still use tips. I really like them. I use this cool little icing bag holder, which is actually one of those little popsicle holders from usually Walmart at end of season. They end up about 50 cents a piece. And I put a little damp piece of paper towel in the bottom, and they make the most perfect little icing holders. And this even works if you use tipless bags, depending on the consistency. But I always like to throw that out there because this is like I can't even work without it. And it's so simple that it sometimes is hard to figure out what I'm doing. But okay, there's that. I'm going to go through, let's change the view again. And I'm going to blend this one and talk a little bit about that because there's things that work for me. I always use an offset spatula. I can't work without it. A lot of people don't feel the same way. They'd rather work with like a little boo-boo stick like this to spread the icing in the crevices, or even a needle tool / stylus. This has a real name. It just escapes me right now. Words are hard, right? But I use the offset spatula. And this is how I make the invisible outline that people like. I start in the corner and I use a squeeze bottle to go right up to the edge. And as I go around the edge, I connect it, and then I come back and fill in the middle. And I fill it almost full, just a few little holes, and they kind of come together. But then I take the offset spatula and I kind of like push it a little bit over that edge where it doesn't show. There are several ways to do this. Like you can use one consistency of icing, which is kind of another class. If you have questions, I'll help all I can. But I usually do outlining and flooding for beginners just because the consistencies are so tricky. It's almost better to start there and then we do other consistencies. But anyway, the offset spatula is my way of pulling the icing over so that you don't see the outline. Now that we are to this step, I'm going to switch it out. This one I made yesterday, so it had time to dry and we didn't have to wait. Another reason why dry time is very good is because sometimes colors like this, if you add the red too soon after, they can bleed into one another, and they actually call that bleeding, and it's like not desirable on a cookie. People get really frustrated with it. I may actually, if I remember after this class, go ahead and do it to see to what degree it bleeds, where I can show you maybe on social media. But you wait till this step is dry so there's no bleeding, and then you come back and add the red. And I'm doing the same thing again. I'm going to make sure that everything's flowing smoothly and pipe my red, and then go to the cookie. Okay, if my head gets in the way, give me a heads up. My husband is doing his best to make me laugh over there. Being funny. Okay, so you go around the edge, and normally I'm going to try to let this go. Remember I said I'm a perfectionist? Normally it kind of drives me crazy if I miss the edge like that, but whenever I decorate in real life, I'm usually like this over the cookie, and so you wouldn't be able to see. If you don't like that, you can scrape it off and redo, but I'm going to try to let it go to be chill. It's not my strong suit. And then move on and flood the red. We'll fill the bottle again. You want to switch views where we can watch? I chose to fill the bottles on camera today too. Again, let's try the top view. Sorry, I want to show the bubbles. Okay, see the bubbles up there? And we're going to use this spatula to kind of spread them out, because since they're all up top like that, they just pop right out. And just to show you, go back to the other view. This is about the consistency I'm using. I don't even know if that qualifies as honey shampoo. There we go. Husband said shampoo. And that's about what I like. And even this is a little bit too thick. So I use a spray bottle away from your cookies, or you'll be really mad later, and spray a little bit of water in there to thin it out. The reason that I use the spray bottle is because it allows you to fine tune consistency changes without running the risk of sticking it under your faucet and pouring in way too much water. And again, I hope this isn't too tedious, but I really like to talk out the why, because I think people actually get as much, if not more, from that than they necessarily do watching me do the steps. But see, the little spatula in this measuring cup helps me get it right in the bottle where I want it, and put the lid on, and then we can flood this part. Another reason I did this, switch views, whenever you outline a cookie, you need to let that edge set up just a little bit, or okay, this edge, because it acts like a dam. So if a dam is dry and solid like cement, it's going to hold the water back. If the cement's wet, it's going to just fall down and fall through. It doesn't have to be completely, totally dry, but dry enough to keep the icing in is what you're going for. But we're going to do the same again. I always start at the seam of I've got the shakes today too. I don't know why, but I start at the seam of the two colors and come back around, and I'm still trying to cover that edge for the invisible outline. But I like to start at the seam so that it kind of butts up against the edge and leaves a smooth like transition. That's a big word for a little cookie, but if the icing flows on its own, it can be kind of like messy and not so clean. And if you butt the icing up against the edge of that line, it just kind of smoothly flows together, and it doesn't need an extra line or something to kind of clean that up or hide it. And by that, I mean, sometimes if I make a mess of this little area, I might come back and put a little squiggly line, and it looks like an accent, but it's also hiding a mess. So it's better to just start against the edge and go around. Okay.
So Kelly,
go ahead.
Sorry, you do have a question here. How long does it take for the bubbles to come up enough before using?
It probably takes 20 minutes, but if you can mix your icing an hour ahead of time, that helps with the bubbles, and it helps with the development to give the icing time to get darker. So the way that I like to approach it, I make my icing one consistency either earlier in the day or even the day before, and I let it sit and develop overnight. And then I bag my my piping icing, and then I do all the outlines while I let the thinned icing sit and let the bubbles come up. And then once I get all of the cookies outlined, I come up and fill my bottles. And it gives me time to get the air bubbles out, and it also keeps the icing from separating in bottles, which can happen. Like if you fill these bottles early, they do tend to separate. And I've got a long spatula, or you can use the end of a spoon to stir it, but I just like it better if it doesn't separate. So I try to package it or prepare it pretty close to whenever at least I'm going to flood. But anyway, if you're in a hurry, you only need to let it sit maybe an hour. But if you have time, it's kind of cool to just prepare everything ahead, wait a minute, and then where you can just sit down and get to work and not have to stop and wait for all these steps or deal with things that didn't quite go how you wanted them to. But it's totally up to you. Because icing, this is a little side note too, icing will actually develop on the cookie, but I just like to kind of know what it's going to do before I actually put it on there. And that's just a perfectionist thing. Like red is not as serious as I can sometimes make it, but if you are going to care what the final product is, the longer you let the icing set, the better idea of what you'll have of what it's going to do ultimately. Okay, so the cookies, I'm going to move on to this step, and I'm actually going to show you two different ways to do this. Check in time. And I'll tell you why and then the why. The first cookie I'm going to decorate, we're going to do it the way that the picture shows that we shared for this class. And then I'm going to show you the version that looks like this and explain why I did it this way, etc. Remember this little template that we cut out earlier? I always keep these, and I keep them like beyond even the cookie decorating, but while I work, because you can use them for other things. And I'm actually going to use this to mark where I want the seeds to be. And again, like I said, you can go for it if you're cool with that. But if you're kind of like a perfectionist like me, I like having guides like this, so they kind of look the same. That's just my aesthetic, I guess. But I'm using a needle tool, and I'm actually poking it through the little dots on the template to show where I'm going to pipe the seeds. And I actually don't know if you'll be able to see this on camera, but I'm going to try to make sure y'all see. But see, yeah, you can barely see. I'll lift it up a little bit. See, I poked those little holes in there using the template. So whenever I take it off, there's little holes in the icing where I can see where to put the seeds. And there's a lot of reasons that I do this too. Like I've noticed if I go rogue and I pipe seeds, the first have like a reasonable number of seeds. And then as I work down the line, then I see empty spaces. And so I might start with 5 little strawberry seeds, which is sufficient. And then by the end of the cookie, have strawberries with 12 seeds on them, which is not only a lot of work on your hand, but kind of unnecessary. So I just use these little guidelines to help myself out. And for this, we're going to use yellow icing. And to be honest, it has been a very long time since I've made these cookies. And so I couldn't remember what size tip I was going to use. So I grabbed a few. And this one is just a plain number 2. But before I put it, slide everything up for just a second. Before I start on my cookie, if you have any doubts about your cookie, do it on something else first. I'm just actually going to see how big of a seed that makes. And I'm going to pipe a teardrop shape, which starts out as a little dot, and then you drag the tip back through and stop squeezing. So this is the size I'm going to get, which I actually think I like. At least I do now. What you do is you place the tip on the cookie, squeeze the little dot. Oh yeah, my husband said can't see. Can you see now? Okay. Dot, and then drag through, and it kind of makes that teardrop shape. Is that pretty clear where y'all can see? So dot, here we go, squeeze and drag. Dot, squeeze and drag. And don't overthink it. I was doing it better before I started saying it out loud and trying to make them. But practice on your little board. And cookie decorating is always fun, and it can be spontaneous. I'm trying to, which direction did I have to look on my phone. I do this too. This is real life, y'all. Sometimes like I get on the internet and see which direction I thought I should pipe the seeds that day. And apparently this is what I thought looked right this day. So that's what I'm going to go with. Chill people can just go for it. I guess I'm not that chill, but I'm going to pipe my little dot and drag through, pipe my little dot and drag through, pipe my dot, drag through, here's a dot, drag through, dot and drag through. So there we've got the seeds. Now that that's all finished, having used the template, I'm going to put this one over here, and I'm going to tell you what I would probably do these days and why. These days, like I went through different phases in cookie decorating. Can we switch again? And it was kind of like, first, I just wanted to master it. And then once I got good at mastery, I wanted to see what I could do and kind of stretch the limits. And then it got to the point where that wasn't so much fun anymore. And I wanted to like take it back to simplicity. And I started actually discovering my personal style and aesthetic. And that goes back to simple. So my husband just answered the phone. Anyway, as I got back to simple, I started like practicing what I call the art of editing and trying to take out any detail that wasn't important. And so now whenever I make things, I try to take shortcuts. And I like the texture of sprinkles, but I also like the simplicity because you don't actually have to mix another color. So now if I made these cookies, this is the approach I would take. I still like icing tips and the texture that adds. But I'd use sprinkles just to completely avoid like having to mix another color. And since I mentioned I'm a perfectionist, like I can really get hung up on something like those seeds, which are not a big deal. And so the sprinkles kind of bring back that little freedom to just be whimsical and sprinkle instead of like having to be perfect to a fault. But anyway, so my cameraman has disappeared, so I'm going to do it kind of this way until he's back to switch. Whenever I sprinkle nonpareils, which are these that I get from Sweet Tooth Fairy, I don't sprinkle them on the icing as soon as it's flooded. I give it like 2 to 5 minutes to kind of set up. He's coming back, so I can set this down to show you. Here we go. If you sprinkle them directly on, they're going to sink into the cookie, and I don't like that for like a million reasons, mostly because if people want to flick them off, if you add them later, they can flick them off if they don't like the mouthfeel. But I like the texture. So I give the sprinkles like 3 or 4 minutes, or the top coat, just to kind of set, and then I sprinkle the sprinkles on. And I'll try to show you an example of the difference in just a second. In real life, I would put this sheet on a sheet pan so I don't have sprinkles all over my floor, but I did not plan for that. So we're just going to go wild today. And this is more my style. I like dots and just fun little accents, and I love sprinkles too, and I want to use them. So this is what I would do now. So anyway, point is this is how to do the exact cookie on the share page. This is what I would do now, and probably closer to my preferred style now. The point is you can do anything you want. You've got to make it yours and whatever feels good. Okay, so now we've got this taken care of. The last step is to add leaves, and I'll check time again. I was actually going to do an icing pod after the fact. So I'm going to go ahead and add the leaves with a leaf tip, and we'll go through the best way to use that. And then I'll go ahead and add the leaves to both of these cookies. And we'll talk about adding the final squiggle of like drizzle of chocolate. And then hopefully I have time at the end to show you a few things to do with leftover icing and how to do the icing pods. So here goes. Let's switch the view one more time. Oh no, just kidding. Poor husband. Okay. I usually still use icing pods like this because I can use the same piping bags for years. Like I probably haven't bought piping bags in 5 years, but I make an icing pod, and I'll show you how this works in depth, but I was going to show you to put the tip on. You cut the little end off, you make sure that the icing is kind of squirting out, and then you add a tip. In this case, I'm going to use a leaf tip, which is a number 67. Found it. And where is my coupler? Okay, so this is a coupler. We'll talk about this in a second. And this is a coupler ring. And I'm going to use the ring to attach it. This is the reason why oh, go ahead. Whoops, Siri. Okay. Anyway, I still use these because I switch tips a lot. So I might be making something and use this green to make a squiggle or like a vine coming off of a pumpkin, and then turn right around and add leaves, which is why I don't really do the tipless thing. But just to say that it's possible to do both, this is just the why I use my medium like I do. To use, send these away. Again, to use the leaf tip, I'm going to slide everything out of the way, clean up my workstation a little bit, which is not actually real life, but we can do it for this. And I'm going to practice piping the leaves before I actually put it on my cookie again. Leaf tips kind of have this triangular cutout. I don't think I can get close enough to show you. That kind of helps. Every once in a while, people that struggle with these, they'll break and kind of mess up at the tip. And usually it means that you need to take a thin knife. Do you have a knife real quick to kind of separate it? And this is not good enough quality to explain that to you really well, but just to try to show you, if you're using a leaf tip like a 67 and it's breaking or not just coming out one smooth leaf, if you stick a thin blade knife in there and open it up just a smidge, that'll help. There's also alternate tips. I want to say 252s or 232s. It's a different kind of leaf tip. I can get you the link later for that as well, that are easier for people who don't like this kind. But anyway, before you go to the cookie, practice here. You squeeze, pull, and stop squeezing to make the point. Squeeze, pull away as you squeeze, and then stop squeezing to let it come to a point. So squeeze, pull. And that one, I was looking at the screen, but squeeze, pull, and stop giving pressure about whenever you want it to. And as we do it on the cookie, I'll show you how to keep that from happening. Get everything back over here. Keep this handy. These needle tools and this little scraper stick is what I really use to keep that from happening. Okay, so start with this one. We'll turn the cookie towards me and I go right up to the edge of the cookie here. And I squeeze pretty hard to make sure that it fills in that space. And as I let go, I pull away. You can kind of see that this tip might fall down. If you want to catch it, then pull it back up. You can use the edge of the stick to do that. Or if for some reason it breaks off, you can kind of shape it back into a point with this tool. We'll do it again here on this side. So I'm putting it right up to the edge and I'm squeezing pretty hard and pulling and then letting go. And it just makes a perfect little leaf. If you struggle with this, again, I'll find the information for the other tip. Oh, my husband's awesome. Look what he found. He found the one that is actually in store. Awesome. Anyway, if you struggle with this tip, let me know. Leave me a comment somewhere on social media or even on the AC Food Crafting page, and I'll let you know what tip is the easier version of this. Anyway, on the first cookies that you saw in the picture for the class, the cutter is a little bit different. It was a different brand. And so it had 4 smaller leaves. And so I didn't switch tips. As I was making these the other day, I was like, oh, this tip doesn't fill up that middle section. So I switched tips in the middle. So I did a 67 on the 2 side leaves like this. And then I switched to a 70 in the middle. You don't have to do all that. That's just Cali craziness again. You can use the 67 all the way through. And I may actually do that on the first one just to show you. But here, I'm going to use the 67. See, it'll kind of fill it up, but I didn't like that, having to ruffle it that much, just again, aesthetic. So for the second round of these that I made, which is like actually years later, it's kind of funny how your styles change. I ended up like switching to a 70 tip. That said, I don't know how readily available 70s are. See, I'm like squeezing and pulling away, and it's just a bigger leaf. And see, I'm going to catch it with my finger to make sure it comes to a point. Anyway, if you don't have the 70 tip, you can do, like I said, all 3 with 70s. You can do all with 67s, or you can be a little bit nutty and switch like me. Totally up to you and your style. But that is how you add the leaves. And ooh, I think I just made a boo-boo turning it around, but that's okay. To finish this up, I'm going to show you how to use piping icing. This is just kind of an ivory-ish color piping icing to add the little squiggle. And then I'll go through and show you a few other things as much as I have time for and answer questions. And then we should be able to finish up. Okay, so I had a number 1 tip on this for whatever reason. It's not going to work. I want a bigger, like little squiggle. And so I'm just going to pop this one on. The cool thing about, you can go for this, like most people will just go for this. If you feel like you need a little bit of guidance, that's what I have this for too. You might just get it beside you to kind of see what you want to do or kind of follow along as you work. So we've got this kind of creamish, just a little bit white icing, a number 4 tip because it's a little bit bigger round. And I'm just going to follow my little sketch and squeeze and just kind of make a little squiggle. And again, like I said, you don't have to like use a projector, but I always want people to have everything they need to make them, to give them the confidence to make them look exactly like this. And that is why it's there, but it's not like a must. Okay, so we got this squiggle in there, and same thing goes again. Just kind of add that squiggle of piping icing. And then you've got the finished cookies. And eventually, my cousin he was in the Army. He just got out, but I'll add squiggles to all of these if I can show you. And then I'll send those to my cousin in Virginia. So he'll have cookies for Valentine's Day. Okay, so that said, instead of adding a brown one, you can go back and use the dark brown icing to do the white, etc. I'm going to kind of scoot everything out of the way so I can show you a few things that are like tips that kind of occurred to me as I was working. We'll
Callie,
change the views. Oh, go ahead.
One quick question. How thick is the leaf icing or the icing that you use for the leaf?
I would say like toothpaste. Like you want it to hold its shape. You know how you squeeze toothpaste and you can make that little swirl, like a little S thing. I would say toothpaste consistency is about what you want it. If you get it too stiff, like you don't want it as stiff as you would use maybe for like royal icing flowers. That's more like putty or something. We're switching the camera view. But for leaves, I like it just more like toothpaste, so it still has some fall and fold. And if you get it too stiff, it'll hurt your hands. So makes it a little bit harder. And also if you get it too stiff on the leaves, they're even more likely to break and split. Okay, so let's see. Let me grab a few things to show you icing pods and why. Make sure I have almost everything I need. Okay, so if you've noticed, all of my icing has like a saran wrap pod of icing inside. This is a cool trick I learned a long time ago, and I use it a lot because it saves me time, trouble, and helps me switch things out. I use press and seal wrap because real saran wrap makes me angry now. Can't handle it. To make these little pods, you pull out a tiny little square. I probably over pulled, but a little piece of press and seal, and you lay it flat on the counter. We're going to switch views. And then we've got my icing, which this is actually the icing I use for the leaves, so I can show you. I've got it in my little measuring cup at the consistency I need it to be. And here, just for a visual, is kind of the consistency. Can we switch views one more time, babe? Okay. So it's pretty thick. It's kind of like toothpaste. It'll fall eventually, but it's going to take a minute. So that's the leaf consistency that I like. See, there it goes. Okay, switch again. So to make these pods, I take my little square of saran wrap. Fun fact, I'm double jointed if y'all have not noticed in this video. It's almost distracting once you do. I probably shouldn't have said it out loud, but I just noticed on the camera. So, okay. And you put probably about 2 to 3 tablespoons in the pod. You can put more if you're piping a lot, but it does make it harder on your hands. I like 2 to 3 tablespoons because it fits right in my tiny hand. And we'll talk more about that in a second. To make this pod, you fold the corners over and then use the press and seal. You kind of press the air out and then you just wrap it up. See, I rolled it up like a burrito. So you've got a square, you're folding it diagonal, and then you're rolling it up. And then you twist the ends to make them tight. And you've got a little pod like this, which is like super cool. Then whenever it's time to put them in the bags, here's like a 600-year-old bag. I actually think that I've probably had this bag so long that it might be a Wilton bag that I washed the label off of. But I slide the coupler through, or this is the coupler. This is a coupler. This is a coupler ring. I put this end through here like this. And then I drop the whole thing in the bag, pull it through tight. And then I use this little band to secure it. They make clips that work for this, IKEA bag clips. There's all kinds of clips, but I just like these because that's what I started with. And then me grab a different coupler. Okay, so here's the ring. And what you do is you kind of squeeze it up to the end. If you happen to squeeze it too far out and you've got a bulge, which I do sometimes, here's a bulge on purpose just to show you. I'll push it back. I'll cut the tip off and I have my icing right here. So if a little bit comes out, then it can drop back into this flood and you can use it later. I don't like to waste anything, obviously. Okay, so you cut the end off and then grab whatever tip you're going to use. And then you put the ring on here. Now, the cool thing about this, if you're wondering why we do this, remember I said I only like enough to fit in my hand. If I know I'm going to pipe 1,000,000 cookies and that this won't be enough icing, the cool thing is if you need to switch this out, you take the end off. You can take this bag, pretend it's empty. I've used all the icing. You pop it right out. You've got this clean bag with a coupler again. And then you've got another pod waiting, maybe the same color. Well, it should be the same color just for contamination if you get any on the end. But you pop it in and you can just go right along your merry way versus filling up a bag that's hard to handle and awkward. You can still keep that precision by keeping smaller pods and switching them out as you work. And also if you're working with stiffer icing, like if you're making royal icing flowers, royal icing isn't as susceptible to heat as buttercream, but it does, after you're holding it in your hot little hands for a while, it does get soft. And so sometimes I like to be able to like put this one aside and let it like cool down and put a fresh one in there. So I don't have to have 17 bags. I might have 17 pods, but one thing going here. That way I don't need a different tip every time, etc. Okay, so we've got this. That's the pod trick. Let me check. I'm going to show you one more cool little thing. And I will make it snappy because it's the end of class. When you have leftover icing like this, don't throw it away. Use the pod trick like I showed you, maybe like take it out of the bag. And then I'm going to do this in the green cup just because, so see, I popped my pot out of there and you can just put it into other icing so you can use it for something else or make depending on the design you're working for, like if you needed yellow first and then you need green, you can add blue to it or add it to the green. And so you use every last speck of icing once you get experienced enough to make the plan, but dump it into the thing. And in this case, pretend like I thinned it down yellow to almost a little bit thicker than shampoo consistency. And instead of throw that yellow icing away that I didn't need, I set up a thing like this. These are, this is a template to make royal icing transfers. And these are like super handy to have around, little dots, because they can be flower centers, or if you're making Lego cookies, you can make a little square and stick those on there and they're Legos. Anyway, another way to save mixing a color or to have something ready for a project, I print out my transfers. We have a lot of these on my blog, but you can buy them on Etsy, lots of places like that. And then I put a piece of transparency paper over this. You can use parchment, you can use wax paper. I use transparency paper because it usually doesn't crater royal icing transfers. And this is like a super fast royal icing transfer lesson. Can answer questions on that later. Okay. And then I use painter's tape to tape everything down, do both sides. And then the icing that we mixed, you come back and make these centers. Now, fast forward that. I did this yesterday because I need to make flowers in a couple of weeks and I didn't want to make yellow icing again or waste it. I let these dry overnight. And if you peel back the painter's tape, and it comes up really easy because painter's tape isn't that sticky, then you can take up this transparency sheet or parchment and see what you use. And look, they just slide right off. And now you've got pre-made little decorations that you can use for other cookie projects. You didn't waste any icing, you got a head. And the reason why I chose yellow is because I made a whole bunch of yellow icing, not thinking to make those few seeds on that strawberry cookie. And I was like, why did I do that? And then I thought, oh, I better use it to do this. And so that is actually a complete side note from the cookies. But if you happen to make strawberries that aren't chocolate covered and want to put little strawberry blossoms in, then tips like this also put you ahead. So anyway, and I'm a little bit over, I'm a minute over. So let's switch views again and I'll finish up. If you make these little transfers, see, they're almost like candy buttons, but they're perfect. They're poofy. If you live in a humid climate, put them in a like Rubbermaid, take and toss, any sort of container like that, but airtight. And if you find those gel silica little packets, they come in shoes, they come in like rice crackers, certain items of food, medicines, stick a couple of those in there. And if you live in the humid climate, that, yes, I'll show you the decorated cookies. If you live in a humid climate, those silica packets will suck away the moisture. If you live where I do, you can like stick them in a box, airtight or not. And if you want to be really careful and not scratch them, layer them between parchment paper and they will last forever. But you'll always have these ready to go. Okay, finished cookies. This is my sprinkle version. Can you see? You wanted the up view? Actually, I can do them both on this view. Whoops. Okay. And I messed these up a little bit by handling them wet. But here's the finished cookies. Here's the ones like with sprinklers, like I'd probably do now. And here's the one with the seeds. There's a picture on the Michael's website and social. I actually posted one on Instagram if you want to really look at the I sat there and didn't rush version and talk. But here's the finished cookies. If there's any other questions, I'm glad to answer them. And if we don't have any other questions, then until next time. And I really thank you for coming and listening to me. I live with non-chatty people, so I know like my rambling of information can sometimes be a lot, but I really appreciate you listening to what I have to say.
Everyone is really appreciative of all the tips and tricks you explained, everything explained today. Everyone just loved it. So thank you so much for an amazing class.
Awesome. And if y'all have, thank you. I see y'all. If y'all do have questions that maybe I don't get to today, or if there's anything you see in this class that you might want to see more in depth, like royal icing transfers, etc., if you let us know, then we can kind of plan classes around that too in the future. So if you'd like to see the non-fast version of prepping royal icing or transfers, what you can do with them, just let us know and we'll try to make sure that we get that information next time.
Okay, thank you so much, Callie, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
See you next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.